If you needed a sign of just how flipped upside down our politics have gotten, this week saw the cause of peace and diplomacy championed by the most watched host on Fox News, as well as the crew over at Podsave America, while the Congressional Progressive Caucus beat such a quick retreat from a call for diplomacy that now seems like there's practically no room inside the Democratic Party for anybody concerned about the rapidly escalating war in Ukraine. So on Monday, the CPC, that's the Congressional Progressive Caucus, had sent a cautiously worded letter to the White House urging Biden to engage Russia directly in diplomacy to stave off a nuclear catastrophe and bring an end to the war, but only on terms acceptable to the Ukrainians. That moderate effort was intended to start a conversation, and it certainly did, though not the one that they were looking for. Amid criticism, CPC Chair Pramila Jayapal first, quote, clarified the letter, saying the progressives still unequivocally supported military aid to Ukraine, and the next day, she then fully withdrew the letter, blaming staff for sending it out unvetted and promising they would only support negotiations, quote, after Ukrainian victory, unquote. So that allowed Tucker Carlson and Tulsi Gabbard to say that Democrats had now become a home exclusively for war hawks.
Progressives in the party, the liberals, acting like liberals have acted for like 100 years and saying maybe we should, and I want to say I agree with them completely, we should try to get a peace forged before we all die, and then they have to retract it? Why?
Here at home and how it's negatively impacting gas prices, increasing inflation, and so on. These progressives in the letter, they didn't say stop sending aid to Ukraine now. All they said was, hey, President Biden, engage in diplomacy. And the response they got, of course, from the warmongers who control the Democrat Party in Washington was to immediately be smashed to pieces, so much so that these Democrat members of Congress cowered in the corner with fear and now have gone so far out of their way, apologizing profusely for having the audacity to call for diplomacy in this war that's putting us all at risk. But now everyone in the Democrat Party and the leadership in Washington is walking in lockstep as war hawks, no one daring to even step outside the line and say, hey, diplomacy, let's exercise diplomacy.
So this kind of segment, which allows Tucker to be the voice of anybody skeptical of war, is exactly what the Podsave boys had warned about earlier that day. So here's Ben Rhodes, a top Obama national security aide, and incidentally the guy who coined the term the blob to describe the reflexively hawkish D.C. foreign policy establishment.
You make the right point that what Biden's saying is, I won't negotiate around the settlement that Ukraine has to accept without them. That doesn't mean we don't have things to talk to the Russians about. It just means Biden's not going to sit there and say, well, maybe you can keep this part of Ukraine and not that part of Ukraine. That's not going to happen. But to your point, if you don't create any space for kind of debate in the center here around this policy, you know where all the concerns about the war are going to go? They're going to go to where Kevin McCarthy took it, right?
Totally.
Which is that like, hey, I'm getting uncomfortable here. There's nuclear threats. Let's cut off the Ukrainians, right?
It's a lot of money.
So, to some of you, like some of the Ukraine stands on Twitter or whatever who like just, pile on this stuff, you might be creating the outcome you don't want, because by punishing anybody who says, let's have diplomacy, the only alternative to your position, is where Kevin McCarthy's going, which is like, hey, let's cut these, where Tucker Carlson is, basically.
Or Elon Musk. I mean, there's clearly a void of people.
There's a void of
and like
discussion.
Elon Musk is filling it, or that guy David Sachs, some like idiot tech investor, right-wing goober is filling it. It's like, why don't we have the CPC, the progressive in the House fill it, or at least try.
Well, that would be a very healthy place to fill.
So Jayapal's claim of a staff error was a terrible look, but it wasn't necessarily 100% wrong. The staff apparently didn't give the other offices a heads up that they would be sending this letter out after several months had been spent collecting signatures. But blaming her staff for that doesn't make much sense, because Jayapal routinely sends out CPC statements without letting the rest of the CPC know that they're coming. In fact, her statement withdrawing the letter itself was not run by the other 29 members on whose behalf she was withdrawing it. The biggest error wasn't in the rollout. The mistake was in retreating. If she'd have stood her ground, the blowback would have died out by the end of the day. And there are a ton of unlikely places she can point to say, look, what we're saying is just common sense. Hell, here's Henry Kissinger. He said, quote, negotiations need to begin. How's your Henry Kissinger? Negotiations need to begin in the next 2 months before it creates upheavals and tensions that will not be easily overcome. Ideally, the dividing line should be a return to the status quo ante. Pursuing the war beyond the point would not be about the freedom of Ukraine, but a new war against Russia itself. Anyway, here's retired Rear Admiral Mike Mullen, who's former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
We've been talking about since before this crisis started an off-ramp for him. I suspect it's in the East, if you will, with those 4 provinces or some combination of them with respect to how it all ends. And that really is up to, I think, Tony Blinken and other diplomats to figure out a way to get both Zelensky and Putin to the table. And as is typical in any war, it's got to end, and usually there are negotiations associated with that. The sooner, the better.
And here's Secretary of State Tony Blinken just 1 week ago.
And we reaffirmed our commitment to meaningful diplomacy that can bring an end to the war, even as Moscow continues to demonstrate through its escalatory actions that its claim to be open to diplomacy is as hollow as it's been since President Putin launched his invasion in February.
And that's not surprising, given that the White House was actually fine with the letter that was later withdrawn. The Washington Post even reported, quote, "The White House did not think the letter was a big deal when officials first received it," a White House aide said, noting that the lawmakers went to great pains to praise Biden's approach to Ukraine and express support for economic and military packages, unquote. Progressives could even also have found backup from the Pope, who said this last month, quote, "After 7 months of hostilities, let us use all diplomatic means, even those that may not have been used so far, to bring an end to this terrible tragedy. War in itself is an error and a horror." So, Emily, you got Kissinger, you got the Pope, you got Mike Mullen, Obama on the Podsave.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.